Welcome back to Subversive Preacher. My name's Cameron Miller, and this is Easter Day. I hope you'll forgive the headphones. I'm practicing on equipment I'm going to use for podcasting in the near future, and they turn out to be helpful for sermons as well. I want to begin today with this quote. "Anxiety and fear are what we know best in this century of ours," Frederick Buechner wrote. "Wars and rumors of wars," he went on to say, "from civilization itself to what seemed the most unalterable values of the past, everything is threatened or already in ruins." So we live on the ragged side of the Rubicon. We live on the far bank of time from which we can see the light behind us and through it the history of humankind. But ahead of us, only a few feet away it seems, is the night, with its magnificence of far-flung sparkling starlight and nebula and the faint heartbeat of the Big Bang. But it is otherwise darkness, with even a layer of kind of fog covering it. And we sense that just steps away may be the edge of the flat earth from which we would fall into oblivion. In short, we fear. And with good cause we fear. Sometimes generalized anxiety comes in the shape of mental illness or with a professional diagnosis. But this fear, the fear that we all share these days, is fact-based, it's experiential. And therapy is not the medicine or the protocol that we need. It says in the Gospel of Mark, the women ran away afraid from the empty tomb. It was empty, no doubt about it. The future is our empty tomb, and we can't run backwards, and we're afraid to run forwards. So here we are, Easter 2024, where fear abounds. Now, how do you like that for the start of an Easter message? But really, if depression is frozen anger and anxiety is volcanic fear, then let's start there. Because the Gospel of Mark leaves us with fear, whereas the other Gospels leave us with proclamations. It's kind of fun, really, to stand up these four Gospels next to each other and compare their tomb stories one to the other. You see, Mark has a young man dressed in a white robe who's sitting in the tomb. But Matthew has a man whose appearance is like lightning. The raiment of white, his raiment is white as snow. And then Matthew, before you can sneeze and before the women have time enough to be afraid, Jesus appears to them. Well, where Mark has a young man in a white robe and Matthew's man in the tomb is like lightning, Luke has two men, both in dazzling robes, who tell the women that Jesus has risen. Afraid for only a nanosecond, the women immediately go back and they tell the men all about it. Now in John, after Mary and then Peter and the unnamed disciple find the tomb empty, the men go back to their homes. But Mary Magdalene, she stays and weeps bitterly outside the tomb. She has plenty of time to agonize. But then two angels in white robes appear in the tomb. They ask her, "What the heck are you crying about?" And when she turns around, there's Jesus. It's all good, no longer afraid. But Mark, as we saw today, he leaves us with just the empty tomb. The women, still afraid, run away and say nothing to anyone. Now, which of those four stories is more like life as you live it? For me, and I would guess for most of us, it's the empty tomb of Mark's story. Do our empty tombs propel us to say, he is risen or he is stolen? Or, as a scientist might, the evidence is that he is missing, but we don't have any data to tell us what happened to him. Both he is risen and he was stolen are leaps of faith. We cannot decide about the data is the safety of agnosticism. And yet agnosticism requires a kind of degree of detachment that a world full of fear and anger and anxiety doesn't really allow for. Now, I'm not really talking about Jesus here in the empty tomb right now. Rather, I'm using it as a metaphor for our moment before our empty tomb. How do we face the darkness of unknowing that lies ahead of us? It seems to me the best way forward is to look at the data. For this, I reference that great source of theological wisdom, Science Direct. The first law of thermodynamics is based on the law of conservation of energy, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but can be transferred from one form to another. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred from one to another. Okay, well that makes sense to me. And while it's only science and, just a theoretical linchpin of the law of physics, it seems like good data when thinking about the empty tomb. Now, let me just admit to you that I am way out over my skis here, since I am truly simple-minded and uneducated in more ways than you can possibly imagine. But I understand in a personal sense, from our biblical story, from my own experience of life and death, and from my experience of the web of life in spiritual community, that Jesus and all who die are not destroyed, but only change form. But there's even more data for us as we stand in front of the empty tomb. You may not, or you may, know much about ecosystems, but you know what one is. For us here in the Finger Lakes, Seneca Lake is obviously near and dear ecosystem to our hearts. We know that there is a direct relationship between the health of the land around the lake and the water quality in the lake. Now that's both easy to understand and easy to ignore. But that relationship between land and lake, is an ecosystem. Now, I found a great scientific paper on ecosystems written by a guy named Michael G. Burton of the School of Physics at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and also the School of Cosmic Physics at the Dublin Institute in Advanced Studies. Now, I like to think that I work in the School of Cosmic Physics, but it's clearly a different kind. Anyway, the abstract that I read defines an ecosystem as a place where energy flows and material cycles are maintained in an apparently stable, but non-equilibrium state through the process of self-regulation. Now that's a sophisticated way of saying that an ecosystem is made up of elements that are in an interdependent relationship with one another. And like our households or our spiritual communities, what one does or doesn't do impacts the rest of us because we're all intricately connected. We constantly seek balance, yet are almost always out of balance, but we counterbalance each other anyways, at least most of the time. So this guy's paper sets out to show that 4 different ecosystems of vastly different sizes and complexities are all ecosystems, and that they have the same elements and dynamics. Are you ready? Because this is really cool. The 4 ecosystems that reflect each other are a cell, a forest, the Earth, and the galaxy, the Milky Way. Excuse me. Now, I know you come here to celebrate Easter and resurrection, and you're getting a science lecture instead. But remember, I'm not a scientist, and this isn't science. It's data that we need for the empty tomb. What thermodynamics and ecosystem data guys are telling us is that the cosmos, everything we see and everything we don't see, are permeated like the aroma of baking bread coming out of the oven, are permeated with resurrection. I know they probably wouldn't say it that way, but that's the takeaway I get from the data. We live in an entire cosmos that is built upon interdependence, hyper-connected, with all elements sharing mutual vulnerabilities. Whether it was the first living cell that appeared in the warm ooze of a shallow ocean covering the face of the earth at creation, or in the nanosecond following the Big Bang, or anything in between, we are in relationship to it all. In fact, we embody that energy, literally. We are that energy that has been around from the beginning. And we will continue to embody that energy somehow and in some way long after our current physical bodies die. So here's the thing. Our ancient ancestors, they didn't know the laws of physics nor any biological sciences to tell them any of that stuff. And yet they knew about the creator of all that is and the exquisite interdependence of the creation. Those ancients that we think of as primitive dummies that didn't have or know all the cool stuff we do, knew about the continuation of life beyond the death of the body. They knew energy that can't be created or ended but only transformed. And they knew it in the same way that we know it, even without all that scientific data. We experience it at the end of our fingertips. And from all that we see and smell and hear, this universe, this life of ours, is rife with resurrection because God created it that way. We may be living in a time of fear, but as the angels were reported to have said over and over and over again in biblical stories, we need not be afraid. The tomb is empty. But of course, empty is just one stop on a chain of events that leads to life. And we have data for it. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss anybody's anxiety or fear, as if there's nothing to be concerned about. But what I am saying is that there is data for addition of perspectives. We might just be part of something that is so much bigger than we are. Seems to me that should give us confidence that nothing we experience is the last word on life. Or to steal and change a phrase from Rainer Maria Rilke, God has music that we haven't heard yet. Happy Easter. I wish you peace.